to be here with you, and unlike Pastor Jean, I do not memorize my messages. I had a different homiletics professor, and I'm kind of glad for that, because I wouldn't want to have to memorize. So I do use notes. This week, South Africa has been, if I stand here, you can see me. If I stand here, you can see me. Hi. I'll let you guys. This week, South Africa's been in the news a lot because for a couple of reasons. One of which is that Nelson Mandela continues to be very ill, and the second reason because our president and his family are visiting there. They've been in Johannesburg, and today they are in Cape Town. If you've ever been to Cape Town, South Africa, you know it to be a place of absolutely astounding natural beauty. It's nestled neatly between mountains and the sea at the southern end of the African continent. I traveled there about 3 years ago with a group of seminary students from the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, where I serve as an adjunct instructor. Our purpose for the trip was a cross-cultural immersion trip. We spent 2 weeks in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, and also in the neighboring country of Namibia, meeting with local religious, political, and social service leaders to study the challenges of church and society in two nations that until 20 or 30 years ago were immersed in apartheid, a deeply segregated system that gives unprecedented privilege to the white minority at the expense of the majority, non-white population. Flying from Johannesburg to Cape Town on a clear and sunny day, we marveled at the gorgeous landscape that we could see from the windows of the aircraft. It was just simply magnificent with the mountains and the sea. But as we made our descent toward the airport in Cape Town, we noticed something very curious, that flashes of bright light were kind of beaming up at us from this vast, stark landscape near the airport. Now, mind you, we were not being shot at from the ground. This was not aircraft artillery. What we realized as we made our final descent was that these bright lights were the reflection of the sun off the tin roofs of wood and cardboard shacks in a slum that extended for miles and miles and miles. It's called Khayelitsha, and it's a township that was established in the 1980s, early 1980s, when blacks were forcibly removed from their neighborhoods within the city of Cape Town to an area called Cape Flats, several miles from the city. And in the process, it cut them off from the form of transportation that took them to their jobs. So today, there's 500,000 or so people who live in Khayelitsha, 80% of them in poverty, and 50% in abject poverty with no running water. HIV/AIDS is rampant and infects more than half the population. As a result of the devastation of AIDS, 30% of the households in Khayelitsha are headed by children under the age of 13. Think about that in light of the glorious blessing of children, and I couldn't help but think, as I looked at these children, in Khayelitsha, 1/3 of you would live in households headed by someone under the age of 13 because of AIDS. Now, during our visit to Cape Town, we met with two clergy. One is a white Dutch Reformed pastor named Leon, who heads a large affluent church in the suburbs, and the other pastor was Zola, a black pastor, who heads a Pentecostal church in Khayelitsha. Their two churches have been in covenant for 7 years, working together to promote systemic change in Khayelitsha. From them we heard, as we heard from others during our visit to South Africa and Namibia, that by and large the church, especially in South Africa, is being held hostage by local leadership, by its local leadership. Independent megachurches are flourishing in the black townships, and people flock to them to hear the message of the prosperity gospel, which goes something like this. God wants you to be rich, the pastors say, and God wants you to prosper financially. Just pray for it, name it, claim it. And when you do start to prosper, you need to return a significant portion of that money back to God by giving it to this church, which is a strategy that enriches many pastors while keeping their parishioners in poverty. The other message that pastors tell their people is that people have AIDS because it's God's punishment on them as sinners. So people don't much like to talk about AIDS, and as a result they're not educated about it, about how it's transmitted, nor how it can be prevented. So despite the fact that South Africa has the highest incidence of AIDS in the world, the disease is a hushed secret in many quarters, especially in the churches. And people are dying in droves because of that. But after 24 years in the ministry, and after losing 2 of his sisters to AIDS, Pastor Zola Skosana of Khayelitsha had had enough. So 3 months after we met with him in Cape Town, Zola caused a stir in churches throughout South Africa and made the BBC International News when he announced his 3-part sermon topic from the pulpit. Jesus had HIV. Well, you can imagine the shock and indeed the outrage from clergy colleagues in the Cape Town townships who strongly opposed associating Jesus with HIV. That's not surprising. But Zola pointed out that Jesus freely took upon himself the infirmities and brokenness of humanity. And he said, and I quote, that he was using the metaphor of Jesus having HIV to highlight the danger of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which still carries a stigma in South African townships. He wanted to get people's attention, and he did. Now, for Pastor Zola, when orphans under the age of 13 are heading 30% of Khayelitsha's households because their parents have died of AIDS, for the church to refuse to educate people about HIV/AIDS is both a theological and a moral issue. And it's one that was echoed for us during our visit to Cape Town by a Methodist theologian named Dion Forster, who's written that with the pandemic of AIDS in South Africa, the church itself, the body of Christ, has AIDS. Like Zola, Dion has been vilified for daring to suggest that HIV/AIDS is an issue that demands the church's attention. Jesus had HIV, said Pastor Zola. He concluded his sermon by taking an HIV test in front of his congregation, after which 100 churchgoers followed his example. So, facing into one's destiny with single-minded intention and grim determination, doing the work because it's the right thing to do no matter the cost. That's what Pastor Zola and the courageous people who support him are doing in one of the poorest townships in South Africa to address a disease that's robbing 1/3 of the children of their parents. Now, I don't know what gospel text Pastor Zola was reading as he prepared a sermon on Jesus having HIV, but he may well have been thinking of today's passage from Luke. In Luke, we're at a turning point in the gospel, starting with today's reading. For today, Jesus begins his journey to Jerusalem, and he does so with single-minded intention and with grim determination. We're at a turning point there because after his transfiguration on the mountaintop, which we heard about a few weeks ago, in the presence of Moses and Elijah, he went down from that mountaintop with Peter and John and James, and he once more told his disciples that he would be betrayed into human hands, but they didn't understand him. They kind of never do. And that's understandable. I don't know if we would either. You know, it's easy to mock out the disciples, but what Jesus said to them was shocking. But they were more interested at the time in arguing about who among them was the greatest. So Jesus said then, Luke says, when the days drew near for Jesus to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Now, most pilgrims to Jerusalem in those days would take the long way around. They'd go from Galilee, along the Jordan to Jericho, and then come back in from the east. That was the long way. But Jesus took his disciples the short way, which was right through Samaria, where they met rejection. Now the disciples wanted Jesus to punish the Samaritans for that by raining fire down from heaven like Elijah had done hundreds of years ago. But Jesus had set his face toward Jerusalem, where more urgent matters awaited him. So they moved on. So when one of them traveling along the road with Jesus said, "I will follow you wherever you go," Jesus teaches him and the others what discipleship means and says, "The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Two more people say they want to follow Jesus, but one needs to bury his father first, and the other wants to say goodbye to his family. And Jesus says, "No. Proclaiming the kingdom of God is more urgent. These other matters can wait." Now, we have to realize that Jesus often used exaggeration, hyperbole to make a point. He wasn't telling them or us to reject our families. Not at all. He's not telling us to reject our responsibilities to our families, but rather he's encouraging us to see the needs of our families in light of our faith and through the lens of our deepening commitment to Christ. As one commentator put it, how are our lives different as followers of Jesus than they might have been otherwise? Or to use the language of today's gospel, as a follower of Christ, to what commitment and to what destiny do you set your face? Now, I began with a story about one South African who got people's attention to make change in rather a shocking form that shocks us as well. But this week we've also been hearing of the critical illness of another person, courageous South African, and that's Nelson Mandela, bringing to fruition his vision of a free and democratic society with equal opportunity for all has been his life's work. The cause to which he set his face and spent 27 years in jail. Now, he originally was put in jail in 1962 for life imprisonment. But he was freed because the white prison warden of Robben Island was so impressed by Mandela's dignity, humility, and compassion that he lobbied the government for Mandela's release. And so he was released. And immediately after that, he started to negotiate with F.W. de Klerk, who was the president of the ruling party, to abolish apartheid. And it's incredible to think about, but in 4 years, from the time that he was released from prison, he became, in the first multiracial election in the history of South Africa, its president. It's astonishing what God, talk about God doing a new thing. So his life has not been without controversy, Mandela's has not. But there's no question that this man who set his face to fight oppression did so with dignity and grace. This is a quote from him that appears on there's a Mandela museum at the house where he had lived in Soweto, which is the black township in Cape Town, one of the black townships. And there's a quote from a letter that he wrote to his wife from prison in 1977. At that point, he'd been in prison 15 years. And he says this: "In judging our progress as individuals, we tend to concentrate on external factors such as one's social position, influence and popularity, wealth, and standard of education. But internal factors may be even more crucial in assessing one's development as a human being. Humility, purity, generosity, absence of vanity, readiness to serve your fellow men, qualities within the reach of every human soul." As I thought about that this week, I thought, oh my, how closely that resembles the passage on the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians today, when Paul says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Surely Nelson Mandela has been an example of that. So how is my life different as a follower of Jesus than it might have been otherwise? To what commitment and destiny am I willing to set my face as a follower of Christ? Those are challenging questions. I've told stories today of two bold South Africans who've risked reputations, if not their lives, to overturn oppressive structures or cultural mores that hold people in bondage and indeed threaten their lives. But there are also stories here in Akron of people who've set their face to take a new road, leaving the familiar to travel to that strange place where God has called them to do God's work in the world. One such woman is Hannah, a gifted social worker in her mid-20s, who for the last couple of years has served as coordinator for the Bridges Out of Poverty initiative in Summit County. Some of you will remember her from when she and I did a Bridges Out of Poverty workshop here a year or so ago. Hannah is a deeply committed Christian woman with a passion for working with the poor, and in her work she showed wisdom beyond her years in expanding the outreach of Bridges in our community. But last week at a Bridges Out of Poverty meeting, we had a goodbye celebration for Hannah because she's leaving to take a new job. She told us that Bridges was her dream job, and she couldn't imagine leaving it. But last fall, out of the blue, she received an offer to work for a faith-based organization in Colorado. It would mean moving away from her family with whom she's very close. It would mean selling the house that she and her husband love. It would mean that her husband would have to start all over in his business, and it's a relationship-based business. When Hannah got that job offer, she dismissed it out of hand. Why would I leave a dream job, my family, my friends, my house, and ask my husband to close his business and start again? But her husband encouraged her to pray about it, to consider what God was calling her and calling them to do. So they prayed. And gradually it became clear. God was calling them to new challenges, to leave the family, the familiar behind, and to set their face toward a new commitment and destiny as followers of Christ. And believe me, as that 20-some woman told us that story, I certainly felt convicted. Wow, what courage it takes for her to do what she's doing now, and for her husband to support her in that. So I think about, how is my life? How is your life different as a follower of Jesus than it might have been otherwise? To what commitment and to what destiny have you set your face as a follower of Christ? Those are questions that we can take to God and to ourselves today.